And it is also part of the project that Uli mentioned on meaning-driven register variation. So Anton's introduced a lot of the background, so I'll go pretty quick. Hold on just a minute. I'll go pretty quickly, but I do just want to briefly introduce what sort of the problem is that we're starting out with here. So again, the topic is numerical imprecision, and the basic fact is something like this. If in many choices, speakers have the option of choosing to describe an event at greater or lesser degree of precision. So suppose I see an accident when I left my house this morning. I could potentially be in the position to describe it at least one of these three ways. I could say the accident happened at 7:58. I could say it happened at 8 o'clock. I could say it happened at about 8 o'clock. And some questions that have been fascinating me for quite some time are, on what basis does the speaker choose? And then what does that choice convey about the speaker? Certainly it says something about the speaker's epistemic state, but then the question is, what might it say further with respect to the speaker's stances or goals or what sort of person they are? And the perspective we're taking is that imprecision, or I should say numerical forms in their more and less precise instantiations, can be viewed as a pragmatic variable. That is a variable whose variance, unlike the case of, say, phonological variation, a variable whose variants differ non-trivially in their semantic content, but which nonetheless can be used in the same situation to achieve the same communicative goal. So here's basically the roadmap for our talk, for the talk today. I'm going to very briefly present some findings in 2 or 3 different areas that have motivated our research questions. I'm going to present the results of 2 experiments on the social perception of imprecision. This is work that's we've just submitted to a paper on this. So if anybody wants to see the paper, please write to me and I'll be sure to pass it along. And I'm going to then conclude with some more general observations on the interaction of context and pragmatic reasoning and social meaning. So what we're talking about, what we're talking about here does not have it in the specific topic have a lot to do with harmful speech, but I think some of these more general observations, takeaways are relevant for that area as well. So here we go, some background. So the first background, the first basic observation here has to do with the expression of precision versus approximation. So first of all, it's been observed, this goes back in particular to Manfred Krifke's work, that non-round numbers are interpreted imprecisely, whereas, what did I just say? Non-round numbers are necessarily interpreted precisely, while round numbers allow and often favor a precise interpretation. So if you look at just the examples on the first set of examples here, those on the right, like Anna has 99 sheep, is interpreted precisely, but those on the left with the round numbers tend to favor an approximate interpretation. Anna has 100 sheep can be interpreted to mean that she has something like 100 sheep, something around 100 sheep. Approximation or precision can also, as we just heard in the previous talk, be signaled explicitly via words that you could call precision regulators or approximators. So we can say Anna has roughly or about or approximately or around, even spelled right, 100 sheep. Or we can say something like the talk lasted exactly 45 minutes or the talk lasted 45 minutes precisely or something like that. Okay, so now the second, just a minute here. The second observation is that which of those forms is chosen is dependent on the context of utterance. So the observation that one being precise or being approximate, which is appropriate, depends on the context. That goes way back in the literature. But you can also substantiate this with empirical data. So to the extent you could get at this in corpus data, we have corpus data that would suggest that the frequency of using explicitly approximate forms varies by register or by text type. These are some data from the core corpus, which gives a value for the proportion of numerical tokens that have an explicit approximator or approximating construction like about. And we find that approximate forms are more common in informal and interactive speech and writing than in formal speech and writing. And they're also interestingly, they're more common in instructional text types like how-tos versus informational and persuasive text types. We're going to come back to those concepts a bit later. And we also see it at a more, that was sort of the macro picture. We also see it at a more micro level where we look at where it's been demonstrated that speakers are sensitive to hearers' precision needs when choosing how to be precise, specifically in choosing whether to round off the information they provide. So suppose my watch says 10:46 and somebody asks me what time it is. If they say, I have an appointment at 11:30, so sometime fairly distant in the future, I'm more likely to round and say it's 10:45 than if they say I have an appointment at 11 o'clock. In other words, very close to now, and then I'm less likely to round. The authors who have demonstrated this have argued that rounding is a hearer-oriented strategy. It's a strategy aimed at reducing processing costs on the part of the hearer, making the utterance easier for the hearer to process. Okay, so that's one piece of research that, one sort of motivating set of findings that rounding or approximation versus precision is context sensitive. The second point is that precision versus imprecision, or round versus non-round versus round numerals, have been shown to index different perceptions of the speaker or writer. So the imprecision has social meaning, we could say. So interestingly, some of the first research on this comes not out of linguistics or sociolinguistics or anything like that, but out of research on applied psychology and advertising research and the psychology of negotiation and topics like that. So for instance, if a car is advertised as having 10% lower carbon emissions versus 10.2% lower carbon emissions, the more precise description, the non-round number, the more precise value results in higher perception of the company competence. Now, there is work in sociolinguistics, particularly by my co-author, Andrea Beltrama, where he did a social perception study comparing round and non-round numbers. So round numbers allowing the imprecise interpretation, and non-round numbers interpreted precisely. And what he found was that speakers using non-round numbers are judged as more intelligent, educated, articulate, and hardworking, but also more pedantic and obsessive and uptight than speakers using round numbers. The charts are from his study, and the solid line at the top is the non-round numbers. The dotted line are the round numbers, and you see there's quite a difference. So we took those two sets of findings as the starting point for what we've done here. And the questions we're addressing in this research are the following. First, we sought to get a more complete understanding of the social meaning of precision and imprecision by looking also at explicitly approximate forms. So previous work has only has only typically compared round and non-round numbers, but we also wanted to get at the social perception of explicitly approximate forms. This is important, if nothing else, because they're very, very common in speech and writing. And related to that, we wanted to understand what, if any, were the indexical associations of low precision or approximation. The work I just showed you and other work in that general area has tended to focus on traits that are indexed by highly precise forms. So traits that are and that includes both positive ones like intelligent, but also negative ones like uptight. And our question was, well, are there also positive and or negative traits that are explicitly that are indexed by the choice to be approximate? And what we hypothesized going into this was, in particular, we would be likely to find that such forms convey dimensions of helpfulness or likability. That the speaker is a likable person, shall we say, or a helpful person, and that comes from the finding I had shown you from van der Henst et al. That or the finding indicative that rounding is a hero-oriented strategy, and we hypothesized that would have a reflex in the social meaning attributed to round or approximate forms. And then what we especially wanted to look at was, to what extent does the speech setting, the context, affect the social perception of precise versus approximate variants? And this would be very much in line with work in social linguistics, which shows that social meaning is a sort of a situated entity, in the sense that it's what social meaning is derived from the choice between variants is dependent on the context. Okay, so let me take you through two experiments where we investigate these things. So here's our first experiment. It's a social perception study, a match guise study, which basically shows separate populations of subjects, some text produced by some described as being produced by some speaker or writer, and the text is presented in different guises to different sets of speakers that correspond to the different variants of the variable under consideration. This will be clear in just a minute. And we manipulated two factors. One is the precision level, that's the variable we're interested in, and the other is the type of utterance context. And then for all of these, we evaluated, we obtained ratings of the speaker on 10 attributes which we thought would correlate positively with either precision or approximation or imprecision. Okay, so here's what we looked at. These were the variants of the variables we looked at. We looked at what we call precise forms. That would be an unmodified non-round number, such as 49 minutes. We looked at underspecified forms, which are unmodified round numbers. So I had said that round numbers like 50 minutes or 100 or so forth can be interpreted approximately. They can also, of course, be interpreted precisely. So in that sense, we are calling them underspecified. And then we also looked at explicitly approximate forms. So that would be a round number modified by an approximator about or around, such as about 50 minutes. And then we looked at these three types of expressions in 4 context types. And sorry, this slide is a little text heavy. I didn't find a way to make it less text heavy. Okay, but we looked at 4 types of utterance context. The first is what we call a for the record context, where the speaker is providing information for official purposes. So in a setting where it will be recorded. So the classic example is here, the speaker is testifying in court. And I should have said that these 4 context types, we conceptualize them as varying according to the level of precision required by the context or expected in the context, but also the speaker's goals. So this context type was intended to reflect a context of, to reflect a high need for precision. And here the speaker's goal is an informational goal, providing information for the record. Then we had a persuasive concept where the speaker is aiming to persuade their interlocutor to take some course of action, like buy a car. Precision need isn't perhaps not quite as high there. And the speaker has a very clear goal. It's a persuasive goal. We included this one particularly because of the findings from advertising research and so forth that I highlighted, and also the corpus data, but particularly the work from areas like advertising research, which suggested that being precise helps in persuasive situations. Then we had what we call the stranger concept, a context where the interlocutors are strangers to one another who are making small talk in a public setting. So they're just making small talk at a bus stop, for instance. Here, there's no requirement for high precision, so the precision need is low, and the speaker goal, I'm not sure what you want to call making small talk, but sort of, satisfying social niceties or such. And then finally, we have what we call the bonding context, where the interlocutors are acquaintances or new colleagues in some social setting who are explicitly described as wanting to get to know each other better. Here again, the precision need is low, but there's a very explicit speaker goal, namely building relationships. So here's what the items look like. Again, there's a lot of text here, so I apologize for that. So in each item that subjects saw, they saw two context sentences that set up a speaker and the situation that individual is in, and said something about what their goal is. And then they saw a target utterance, which is the utterance that speaker produced, which included two occurrences of a numerical expression at one of the three levels of precision we were interested in. So I'll read one of them, and then you can sort of imagine what the others look like. In the for the record context, the context sentences were: a person is testifying. Now I'm not going to be able to read this because my little box is in the wrong place. Okay. A person is testifying in court as a part of a lawsuit relating to the dysfunctional public transportation system in their area. It's crucial to be accurate. And then what that speaker says is, normally the trip to the airport takes, and then it varied according to guys, 21, 20, or about 20 minutes. But since the storm damage to the tracks last year, it takes 49, 50, around 50 minutes. Sorry, now this doesn't. And we had speakers rated on 10 speaker attributes grouped into 3 core dimensions. 4 are what we call status attributes: intelligent, articulate, confident, and trustworthy. Those were ones that in previous work, we've had reason to think that these will correlate with high precision. 4 were what we call solidarity attributes, which we expect to relating to dimensions of sort of likability or helpfulness, which we predicted to correlate with approximation. These are similar to what Roland had talked about yesterday, the dimensions of competence versus warmth. I think there's a lot of overlap here. And then finally, we had 2 dimensions, which we call anti-solidarity. These were the negative associations with precision that were found in Andrea's earlier work. And since they sort of have to do with like lack of likability or lack of social attractiveness, we refer to them as anti-solidarity. So this is just some details of exactly how we did this. And here's some predictions. As I sort of implied before, regarding the dimensions of social meaning, we expected the precise variance, that's the unmodified round numbers, to elicit higher ratings on status and solidarity, and anti-solidarity, the approximate variance to index higher associations on solidarity. And then in terms of context dependence, what we expected was that in the for the record and persuasive context, those are ones with moderate to high precision need, and where in essence the speaker's credibility is at stake, we will observe the positive status associations of precision relative to approximation. On the other hand, in the bonding scenario, and perhaps also the stranger scenario, those are the scenarios where there's a low need for precision and where something like likability is at stake. This is where we expect to see the negative anti-solidarity associations of precision and the positive solidarity associations of the choice to be approximate, the use of an approximate form. Okay. This is, those are the predictions. Here's what we did. The first thing we did just a statistical technique, a principal component analysis to determine whether those sets of 10 attributes really clustered into the three groups that we had intended them to do. And in fact, they do. The first, so we have a cluster of properties that we're calling status, a cluster of properties that we're calling solidarity, and a cluster of properties that we're calling anti-solidarity. And in what follows, I'm going to present the ratings on the composite ratings on the factors rather than the ratings on the individual attributes, which is just too much data and not terribly helpful. Okay, so here's what we find. These are the results for the status factor. The bar chart on the right shows the ratings. These are at mean ratings on a 7-point scale. For the three variants, precise is blue, approximate is blue, underspecified is green, and precise is red. And so that we find that in the for the record context, but none of the others, the precise speaker is rated higher than the approximate speaker. So the speaker who says 49 minutes is rated higher than the speaker who says about 50 minutes on status dimensions. And we find no effect in the other, no significant effect in the four other scenarios. On solidarity, this is where we expected we would see an effect of, we would see an advantage for approximate forms. The speaker who uses an approximate form like about 50 would be rated more highly. Here we find no significant main effects across the board. There's a little bit of a hint that in fact the approximate speaker is rated more higher, but the magnitude doesn't reach significance. And then finally, in the bonding context, this is the relationship building context, we find that and this is on the anti-solidarity dimensions. These are the attributes uptight and pedantic in the bonding context, but no other. The precise speaker and the speaker who uses the underspecified form, that's the unmodified round number, is rated higher on anti-solidarity than the speaker who uses the approximate form. And there's no effect in other scenarios. So what does that tell us? Okay, so as predicted, we find that in the for the record context, the precise speaker is rated more highly than the approximate speaker on status. And similarly, as predicted, in the bonding, the relationship building scenario, the precise speaker receives higher ratings on anti-solidarity than the approximate speaker. So we found those effects both in terms of that status and anti-solidarity would be associated with high precision, but also that those effects would be context dependent in a particular way. So those predictions were borne out. What was not borne out as a prediction is that we found no association of approximation, the choice to use an approximate form like about 50, with solidarity dimensions. So using say about 50 did not evoke higher perceptions of likability or friendliness than using, say, 49 or 50. We also didn't find a difference in the predicted difference in the persuasive context, but I won't talk about that anymore. So anyways, the other thing we would say is the effects are quite small. And this is actually something that other people have observed, which is that when you seek to test for social meaning and you include richer experimental contexts, and we had to include richer experimental contexts because we were particularly interested in the effect of context, the effects get smaller or even go away. And then we wondered, well, maybe this is a methodological issue. Maybe it has to do with the length of the experiment. Each respondent rated 12 items, 6 experimental items and 6 fillers. So perhaps that was the issue. Maybe there was some respondent fatigue. So we basically did the same thing using a different design. So here's our second experiment. I won't go through the details. It was all the same, except for 2 crucial things. One is we used a combined verbal and visual presentation of the context. And the second is that we did a fully between subjects one-shot design. So every subject saw only one item and gave a rating for one item, gave a rating for the speaker in that context on those same 10 dimensions, but that's all they did. They didn't do repeated items. Here's what an example looks like. Here's the for the record context. We see we've created a little situation where somebody is testifying in court. There's a brief introductory sentence. A recent storm damaged the train tracks and the transportation system in the city has become completely dysfunctional. A group of locals have filed a lawsuit against the city and their representative is now testifying in court. And now you have somebody in court asking the representative a question about the trip to the airport, and the speaker who we're interested in answers with one of the versions of the target utterance you see below, again, varying the precision level. Here's the other, I won't go through all of these, but here's the other context. The persuasive one is also in an office setting. The stranger context, it's the same context. The stranger context is at a bus stop, same people, but at a bus stop. The bonding context is at a nice, lively party. And again, we validated the core dimensions, and it pretty much works the same in the sense that we still have the same 3 dimensions we're interested in. And here are the effects. Once again, in the for the record context, we find that we find an effect on status dimensions, intelligent, articulate, confident, and so forth. So in the for the records setting, both the precise and underspecified variants receive higher ratings on status dimensions than the approximate variant, the speaker using the approximate variant, and there's no effects in other scenarios. Here, in difference to our first experiment, we do find an effect of solidarity, which almost across contexts, we find higher ratings for the approximate variant than the precise variant on solidarity dimensions. That's again like friendliness and likability and coolness, practically across contexts, although it doesn't hit significance in one of the contexts. And again, we see the same association of precise forms with anti-solidarity dimensions in the bonding context and nowhere else. So just to summarize, we find the same in this second methodology, we find the same significant effects that we found in the first experiment, status associations of precision in the for the record context, and anti-solidarity associations of precision in the bonding context. Plus we, for the first time, thank you, perfect. For the first time, we also find solidarity associations of approximation across contexts. And I'll say also that although I'm presented 2 experiments, there have been several other experiments leading up to this one of various forms. And this was the first experiment, this last one was the first one where we found the predicted association of approximate forms with dimensions like friendliness or likability, which was a bit of a surprise to us, and we're going to go on. We're going to talk about that. Okay, so where I want to conclude, I'm actually for once almost on time. I want to conclude with some observations on what this tells us about context and pragmatic, the link between context and pragmatic reasoning and social meaning, which is sort of the broader question we're looking at here. So just to recap the sort of the overall conclusions here is, I think that this work is further evidence that precise and imprecise numerical expressions represent a pragmatic variable whose variance can index properties and stances of the speaker. Both precise and approximate forms can convey social meaning, though there's this interesting thing is that the associations of precise forms have both the positive ones and the negative ones are turning out to be stronger and more consistent across contexts and across experimental designs than those of the latter. And again, these indexical associations are dependent on the utterance context. So here I will make 3 sort of further observations about this. And one is that pragmatic expectations linked to the speech setting, here expectations about how precise it's necessary to be in this situation, shape the social meaning that is attributed to the different variants. Specifically, in the situation where we have a high need for precision, that's our for the record context, it's the precise speaker who's perceived more favorably than the approximate speaker. In the situation where there's a low need for precision, and again, this is specifically our bonding context, it's the approximate speaker that's perceived as more favorably than the precise speaker. The precise speaker is more likely to be perceived as, say, uptight and pedantic. And so one way you could construe this is to say that there is a penalty in terms of social perception for not complying with the contextual, spelling mistake, for not complying with contextual expectations. So the speaker who is approximate in a situation that calls for precision, or the speaker who's precise in a situation that calls for approximation, gets a penalty, gets dinged in terms of the social perceptions. But that's sort of an obvious point. It sort of should work with this way if you don't comply with what's expected from the context. It's sort of not surprising that people think you're sort of a jerk. But we think there's a little more to it than this. And the second thing is that in deriving social meaning from pragmatic variations, it seems that hearers don't just reason about situational requirements. For instance, the requirements, what level of precision is required, how precise it's necessary to be, but also about the goals of the interlocutors. And we see this by comparing our bonding and stranger context. both of those reflect sort of casual social situations, and both of them were designed to be situations in which the need for precision is low. But it's in the bonding context where the speaker's goal is explicitly stated as something like relationship building that we see the strong effect of precision on the dimensions we call anti-solidarity. And in this strange situation, yep, 2 more minutes. In the stranger scenario, we see much weaker effects, which actually don't reach significance, though they might if we had larger sample sizes. And finally, there's an interesting point to be made here about the role of I'll put it this way. So the dimensions of social meaning indexed by precise versus approximate variants can be related to their underlying semantics and thus to the epistemic states and communicative choices that license their use. But there is a crucial asymmetry that I think helps to explain our results. And the question is, what sort of epistemic state, what sort of state do I need? What has to be the case for me to felicitously utter 758? The first thing is I have to have a precise state of knowledge. And the second requirement is that I have to choose to communicate precisely. That's a choice that's available to me. And both these precise knowledge state and choice parts of this, we think lead to the specific social meaning that is related to precise forms, both the intelligent, articulate, confident, because it's not much of a, we take that to derive from the precise knowledge needed because a precise form requires precise knowledge, but also the pedantic and uptight associations that are reflect choosing to communicate that knowledge when it's not required. The interesting point here is that to use an expression such as about 8 o'clock, it's less definitive. There's actually at least 2 separate states, 2 separate situations in which a speaker could utter an approximate expression like about 8 o'clock. They could have precise knowledge but nonetheless choose to round off, or they could have approximate knowledge. And we actually had been thinking more about the first of those when we made our predictions, but we think actually that the subjects in our experiment probably we think that our subjects probably didn't actually know which of those states which of the situations applied, and that results in that's the reason for the more diffuse associations with approximate forms. Now, I could go on a bit and talk a little more about some broader points, but I think I'm at the end of my time. So I think I'm going to leave some of the more general prediction for the question period if anybody wants to ask about that. And I'll just wrap up with where we're going in the future is to look at a broader range of communicative settings. And specifically, this gets at David Beaver's question earlier, relating social meaning to production, and particularly demonstrating in these situations that we thought, for instance, require a low level of precision, that in fact, speakers are less likely to be precise than in the other sort of situation. And then the next point is to get to the formal modeling of social meaning and its role in expression choice, which is something that Roland is working on right now. So with that, I will wrap up, say thank you, and I'd love questions. I'm going to stop the share here.
Yeah, thank you, Stephanie. And in the chat, please indicate if you have a question. And also, if you are